Denzel Washington sat in the cold, echoing chamber of the federal courthouse. The air heavy with the scent of polished wood and the weight of unspoken tension. His hands folded calmly in front of him while cameras outside were already transmitting his fate to a ravenous public. Across the bench, Judge Eleanor Thomas, a woman whose reputation for unflinching severity was matched only by her brilliance, shuffled the stack of legal documents that held the verdict, her face a mask of absolute control. The case had gripped the nation for months, twisting between allegations of contractual breaches, accusations of political retribution, and whispers of something far deeper, something that went beyond the surface of legal proceedings and into the murky realm of power plays between Hollywood influence and entrenched judicial authority. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, each syllable a precise cut in the stillness. "Mr. Washington," she began, her gaze locking on him like a steel trap, "this court finds you liable for damages in the amount of $500 million. Gasps erupted from the gallery. Even seasoned journalists shifted in their seats as the figure echoed in the room like a gunshot. Denzel's expression didn't waver, but behind his eyes a storm was building, not of anger, but of something heavier, an amalgam of disbelief, disappointment, and a quiet, burning sense of injustice. He had entered the case knowing the stakes, but nothing could have prepared him for the magnitude of what Judge Thomas had just laid on his shoulders. The fine wasn't merely a punishment, it was a statement. It's a symbolic crushing of a man whose career had been built on integrity, discipline, and truth. For months, he had refused private settlement offers because they would have required him to admit to actions he had never committed. And now, as reporters scribbled and photographers' shutters clicked furiously, the cost of that refusal had crystallized in the form of a financial death sentence. Yet even in that moment, with the weight of $500 million pressing invisibly against his chest, he sat upright, his voice steady when he finally asked, "On what grounds, Your Honor, do you justify taking not just my resources but my name?" The judge's eyes flickered, not with uncertainty, but with something harder to read. An unspoken battle she seemed to be fighting within herself, one the public could not yet see. The courtroom was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights, and Judge Thomas's reply came with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it countless times in her mind. "The law demands consequences for those who exploit influence," she said, her tone balanced between judgment and restraint. "You may believe yourself innocent, Mr. Washington, but the evidence presented was clear enough for this court to act decisively." To the untrained ear, it sounded like another verdict statement, cold and definitive. But Denzel heard more than the words he heard, the strain in her voice, the hesitation at the edges, as though part of her was resisting the very sentence she had just delivered. His legal team, seated behind him, exchanged tense glances. They knew they had argued the case on airtight legal grounds, dismantling the opposition's narrative piece by piece. Yet somehow the gavel had still come down in favor of the plaintiff. Outside the courthouse, crowds had gathered, some chanting in support of him, others shouting accusations, each group holding signs that painted him either as a victim of corruption or as an emblem of unchecked celebrity arrogance. The world saw two Denzels now, the cinematic hero who had spent decades portraying moral strength, and the man accused of backroom deals that betrayed those very principles. But what the cameras didn't know was that beneath the robes, Judge Thomas carried her own secret, one that had tangled her into this case in ways that could never appear on official records. Her decision wasn't the product of legal purity alone. It was entangled in political promises, quiet threats, and the looming shadow of people whose reach extended far beyond the courtroom. The $500 million fine wasn't about money, it was leverage, a calculated wound meant to force Denzel into a corner. And yet there was something else in her expression when she looked at him, something almost human, as though she were silently asking him to endure just a little longer, because the story wasn't over. The days that followed were a maelstrom. News outlets ran 24-hour coverage dissecting every angle of the verdict, analysts debating whether Judge Thomas had overstepped her bounds or demonstrated judicial courage. Denzel's home became a fortress of legal advisors, PR strategists, and family members trying to shield him from the relentless flood of media inquiries. But no matter how many statements his representatives issued, nothing could outpace the narrative being spun by his opponents that he was a man who had finally been caught and punished for years of quiet manipulation. And yet behind closed doors, a different reality was unfolding. Late one evening, Denzel received an unmarked envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a single handwritten note in elegant script. "What I did was not what it seemed. Trust me, and prepare for what comes next." It didn't take him long to realize it was from Judge Thomas herself. The note was both a riddle and a lifeline, hinting that the public humiliation and crippling fine were part of something larger. Something that might even be designed to protect him in a dangerous game he hadn't asked to play. As the legal machinery moved toward asset seizures and appeals, Denzel began to suspect that he had been thrust into the center of a war between powerful factions. One that used the courtroom as a stage, but whose battles were fought in private boardrooms, in shadowed corridors of influence, where deals were struck in whispers and sealed without signatures. The fine, he realized, could be the very thing that shielded him from a fate far worse than financial ruin. Still, the personal toll was immense. Friends distanced themselves, projects collapsed, and his once unassailable reputation seemed to dissolve with every new headline. Yet the more he thought about Judge Thomas's note, the more he recognized a pattern in her behavior during the trial, certain lines of questioning she had subtly avoided. Moments when she could have destroyed him entirely but instead had left small openings for recovery. It was as if she had been signaling him all along, but in a language only he could understand. The turning point came unexpectedly, the form of a private summons to her chambers. Security was tight, and the meeting was off the record, with no clerks or court reporters present. Judge Thomas stood by the window, the city lights casting sharp angles across her face. For the first time, her demeanor softened. She told him that forces far beyond either of them had targeted him because he had unknowingly disrupted a network of illicit financial channels, tied to political operatives and entertainment executives. The case against him, she admitted, had been a carefully constructed trap designed not just to bankrupt him but to discredit him, so thoroughly that no one would ever believe him if he stumbled onto the truth. Her role, she said, was complicated. She had been under threat herself, pressured to hand down a sentence that would neutralize him without endangering her own position or the safety of her family. But in giving him the $500 million fine, she had bought time. The financial penalty kept those same forces from eliminating him outright because now he was considered broken, defeated, no longer a threat worth silencing. As she spoke, her voice wavered, not with fear, but with something closer to guilt. The weight of knowing she had had to wound a man she respected in order to protect him. "You will hate me for what I've done," she said finally, "but if you survive the next few months, you'll understand why it had to be this way." Denzel felt a lump rise in his throat, not from anger, but from the staggering realization of the cost. She had paid to keep him alive in a game neither of them had chosen to enter. In that moment, the courtroom verdict became something else. Entirely, not the end of his story, but the opening move in a dangerous, unseen battle. And for the first time since the trial began, he saw tears in Judge Thomas's eyes, not for herself, but for the impossible position she had been forced to take, and for the man she had to protect by first appearing to destroy.